coming in. Okay. All right. Well, thank you guys for coming in. What a great crowd. I apologize. It's a little warm in here, but can you hear me okay? Yes. Your voice. Our building was built in the early 1970s, and we have the same heating and cooling system that is not functioning, shall we say, the life of a nonprofit. So I apologize for the heat and humidity in here. I hope we'll be so interested in we'll even know this, right?
It's not a train.
That's
what I used to work for.
Oh, well, let's keep our fingers crossed then, huh? Usually I don't like to read an introduction. As a teacher, I like to just speak freely, but I don't want to miss anything because this is pretty impressive. So our speaker this evening, Frederick Beseler, and he is a native of Winona, just down the road. And born in Trumbull, so I'm guessing.
Winona,
Oh, Hacker County?
yeah.
Oh, the Lord. What are we gonna do about this?
I lived in Houston, and when we moved, my late wife, he made the transition to a Viking fan.
Good one.
But not a Brewer fan, but she remained a Brewer fan, where I become a Twins fan.
We'll give him credit for that.
Yeah.
Right? Well, this established young man, has a bachelor's degree in English, and has used it quite well, writing service manuals and all kinds of things, working with the training in multi-stat commercial air conditioning. I couldn't even explain what that was. His job brought him all over the United States. He obviously has an interest in aviation, spending time at Cape Canaveral, which I'm sure scratched you where you itched. Worked at the new Trade Center, the Pentagon, the Queen Mary Hotel, and all over. And in addition to his vast knowledge, which you'll find out here momentarily, about Arthur Donahue, he also does presentations on the women pilots, which is something that I have a personal interest in, who reportedly stayed here in Rochester and were at the airport here in Rochester. So something I find very interesting. Writes for the Caledonia Artist newspaper as well, does speaking about Abraham Lincoln and various other topics. And according to his mother, a big flying fan from an early age in his stroller. And trying to take off.
I have a photograph that she gave me. It would be in the stroller, and I've got my hand up like this. But it's kind of blurry, and if you don't look at it real close, you think I'm giving somebody the bigger salute. But really, you know, I'm pointing at her.
So that's fantastic. And he is soloed, right, in Max Conrad Field in Winona and has his private pilot's license. So a very accomplished man. We are very lucky to have him this evening. Please welcome Frederick Beseler.
Well, I always like to start out by saying, you know, the definition of an expert. The definition of an expert is anybody from out of town. I'm from out of town, but I am not an expert, and what I'm going to do tonight is simply share the results of my research into Art Donahue, probably spanning, well, my initial contact with him goes back to when I was about 10 years old. I was building a model of a Spitfire. We're talking about 1964, 65. So now you know about how old I am. But so I'm building a model of a Spitfire, and in those days, a Spitfire model, it actually came with the glue, and that model was more glue than it was airplane. So I'm working at the dining room table, and my mom happened to walk by. She was a native of Winona, and she looked at, oh, Spitfire. You know, there was a young kid from St. Charles that flew Spitfires with the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain. Well, I'm a 10-year-old kid. I thought, well, that's nice. You know, nothing unusual about that. And so I kept working on the airplane. And by the way, do not build model airplanes over your mom's nice wool rug. Oh, okay. And you definitely don't want to spill model airplane paint on that rug. And that's another story. So on August 20th, 1940, and we're talking a year and a half before Pearl Harbor, British Prime Minister in a speech before the House of Commons said, "The gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, except in the abodes of the guilty, goes out to the British airmen who, undaunted by odds, unwearied in their constant challenge and mortal danger, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never in the field of human conflict is so much owed by so many to so few." So I mentioned how my mom mentioned Art Donahue, and I didn't think anything of it at the time, and then fast forward to 1990 and the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, and I'm in the kitchen, I'm making supper for the kids and my wife, and I'm listening to NPR, and they're interviewing Robert Trout, who was one of Edward R. Murrow's boys in London during the war. And Trout is talking about the Battle of Britain. And something clicked in my head, and I remembered what my mom had said about a young kid from St. Charles who flew Spitfires with the Royal Air Force. And so I thought, I gotta find out who that young kid was. And so what this is the result of my research into him. I've had a lieutenant's interest in airplanes and flying, got my first airplane ride in the next Navy M3M biplane. I attempted to earn Navy wings of gold at one time. I didn't get my wings. I came home and learned to fly on my own. Worked with the Wisconsin Aviation Hall of Fame as a member of the board of directors and written articles for them. So I remembered my mom's comment, and here's the quote from Sir Winston. So it didn't take me too long to start finding a lot of information. I don't know if you know it, but Winona State University digitized all of the Winona newspapers. And since then, the state of Minnesota has worked on this too, digitizing all kinds of different newspapers from around the state. But one of the first things I did was visit the St. Charles Public Library, where I discovered that Art had indeed not only flown Spitfire fighters with the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940. Later, he flew Hurricane fighters in the defense of Singapore in Southeast Asia. So Arthur Donahue was born March 19th, 1913 to Frank and Ada Donahue, who lived on a farm near St. Charles in Winona County. Winona Republican Herald reports that a lusty boy was born to Mr. and Mrs. Frank Donahue on Wednesday afternoon. And so that's where he got started. Early on, it was evident that Art was a very bright young fellow. On at least a couple of occasions. And here's some of the clippings I found. On at least a couple of occasions, Art was recognized for his spelling prowess. This became the foundation of his writing talents. And later he edited the school newspaper, and his sole literary effort prior to his book Tally Ho gave him a Spitfire. But some of these are highlighted. Talking about up here, he's enrolled with the kindergarten, and then down here, the school program, recitation, Landing of the Pilgrims by Arthur Donahue. Over here, talks about the spelling, and those in the 4th grade having an average above 90 for the last 6 weeks. And Art was listed amongst those kids. I think that's pretty good, having a 90 average for 6 weeks. I never achieved that. So from his first book, he gave a little bit of a recounting of his early life. And let's see what we got. Well, this is a graduation, high school graduation photo, 1930. And his diplomas, and lists the folks that were in his class. If any of you are interested in genealogy, you want to know what some of those folks are, you can take a picture of them. Anyway, so in Tally Ho, making a Spitfire, where he talks about getting involved with the Royal Air Force over in England. He says, in this tale of an ordinary American from a Midwest farm coming to a warring country, joining its fighting forces, mingling with its fighting men, and finally fighting and falling and fighting again, I hope that I can tell you enough of what it's like to keep your interest. If I fail, it will be my fault as a writer, but I'm sure that what I've seen and experienced will interest average Americans if I describe it right. I'm an ordinary American myself, and it's been tremendously interesting to me. I was born and raised on a farm at St. Charles, Minnesota. At the age of 18, I went into commercial flying. Art became the youngest commercial pilot in the state of Minnesota at the time. During the years of the Depression, this wasn't always too lucrative, and at various times I worked as a garage mechanic, construction worker, and truck driver, in addition to working on my father's farm pilot. Always, however, I tried to work at some place where I could also keep my hand in flying part of the time. Barnstorming, instructing, and the like, and working as an aircraft mechanic. For the most part of the year, working as an aircraft mechanic. For the most part of the year and a half before I went to war, I was engaged as an instructor at the International Flying School down in Laredo, Texas. As I remember, when I started flying, there were about 120 licensed pilots in Minnesota. And if you had lined us all up at that time and ranked us according to our possibilities of ever flying in a war, I'd have been in about the 119th place. The only one less likely than myself would have been my good friend Shorty DuPonte, than myself would have Shorty DuPonte of Minneapolis. Shorty would never fly in a war for two very good reasons. First, there wasn't enough money in it, and second, there wasn't enough money in it. So, where I gets involved in flying, he learns to fly over at Max Conrad Field in Winona under with the instruction of Max Conrad. And at some point, he buys his own airplane. He had a Nicholas Beasley airplane. It was built down in Missouri. And this last year before last, there was actually a Nicholas Beasley airplane being restored over at Oshkosh, and I actually got to talk to the guy who's rebuilding that airplane, and so at some point there'll be a Nicholas Beasley airplane flying. I mentioned that I grew up in Trempealeau, and I spoke to Jean Hunter from Trempealeau, where I grew up. She had a cousin who lived on a farm in St. Charles, actually next to the Donahue's farm. So one summer day, her family went to St. Charles to visit the relatives. And that afternoon, Art landed his airplane in one of the fields. And Jean recalled her uncle and dad going out to look at Art's airplane. When they returned, Jean's dad explained, Art won't be around much longer if he keeps flying that thing. As for Art's truck driving job, I was told by another Trempealeau resident that Art helped haul supplies, equipment, and materials for construction of lock and dam number 6 on the Mississippi River at Trempealeau, where I grew up. So during the 1930s, and quite likely while also driving truck during the construction of that lock and dam, he also met Edward A. Schubert, Alvin, we call him. Alvin Schubert was a very bright man who graduated as valedictorian at Yellowstone, Wisconsin. Alvin was always tinkering with mechanical equipment and built a generator and electrical system for the Schubert family farm. In his later years, he was the guy that my fellow members of Chapter 307 of the Experimental Aircraft Association went to with questions relative to home-built aircraft, especially relative to propeller design and construction. Even Bernard Keaton-Pohl from down at Terry Road here consulted with Alvin on occasion, especially when Bernard built his Corvair powered airplane. It was Alvin who carved the propeller for that airplane, and Bernard said it was the best propeller he'd ever had on an airplane. Alvin knew what he was doing. One of the first aircraft Alvin built was a Henry McNay Flying Flea. And you can see in the upper right, that's not Alvin's airplane, but you can see the design. It had basically 2 wings, and the up and down was controlled by rotating one of those wings. And they initially had a lot of problems with they didn't have the center of gravity right now. A lot of pilots got killed flying the initial design of that airplane. Well, Alvin had one, built one, and so he asked, since Arthur Donahue was an accomplished pilot already, he asked Art if he would test fly it. Art took it up, once around the field, came back and landed, and he said, I would never go up in that thing again. So that was the end of that. Some years ago, when Alvin passed away, they had an auction out of his farm, and this is the remains of that airplane that Arthur Donahue flew, test flew for Alvin. Alvin had a Harley Davidson engine. You see it around the crankcase there in the bottom of the photo. And it actually apparently had thrown the connecting rod. They had a big hole in the crankcase. But anyway, that's what's left of that. I don't know who bought that wreckage, but hopefully somebody saved it. So with his work, various work, here's a clipping that was from the Winona Republican Herald. Art and another fellow set a altitude record at the Winona Airport. Apparently they went up to something like 7,500 or 8,000 feet in a Spartan flight. Here's a photograph of one of Art's the airplanes that Art actually flew, and I got this picture from a fellow in England, and I had no idea how he came by it. But as you can see on the note on the right side, Arthur Donahue's airplane taken in St. Charles, Minnesota. He fought against Germany and England in 1940. His plane was shot down, but he wasn't killed. Anyway, on the photograph, you have the registration number. So I went into the FAA's records, and by golly, it still shows up in the records. I mean, Art sold it in, I think, September of '39. Don't know what happened to it after that, but maybe it exists somewhere out there in a barn or in a hangar, in the back of a hangar, waiting to be restored. Who knows? So, Art also had experience. He had one of Max Conrad's planes, the Ryan Braun aircraft. Who can tell me what that airplane resembles?
Here in St. Louis.
Here in St. Louis, yeah, that's a Ryan.
Is that from San
Very
Diego?
similar to Lindbergh's airplane.
Was it built in San Diego?
I believe so, yeah, that's where Ryan Aircraft was. Yeah. And then being involved with Max Conrad at Winona, he also became a pilot with the Ford Trimotor that Art or Max Conrad owned. And at one point, apparently Art had it down in Texas. He was getting rides. He was, as mentioned, he was an instructor at the flying school down there. And then there's an article here that talks about how Art was bringing it back. And you probably noticed 144 passenger Ford Trimotor. No, it's 14 passengers. Quite a job getting 144 people in that. But it's interesting because my dad talked about Sunday afternoons. He and some of his pals would jump in their Model A Ford and drive out to the airfield and watch Max Conrad put on an air show with a Ford Trimotor. And I don't mean just fly it around. Max Conrad would literally do loops and rolls with that big airplane. A lot of pilots would say you can't do that with a big airplane like that. Well, yeah, you can if you've ever seen Bob Hoover fly a twin engine trike, or as long as you know what you're doing, you can do just about anything with an airplane as long as you keep the forces under control. So now we come to the high points for Art's flying and writing career. By the spring of 1940, Art was back home in St. Charles working on the family farm and reading the newspaper accounts of Nazi Germany's conquest of Europe. In June, Winston Churchill noted the battle for France was over and the Battle of Britain was about to begin. Art decided, and he says this in his book, he decided it was better to fight them over there than over here, which he felt certain would happen if England fell. He determined that with mechanical and piloting skills, he would assist England in their fight against Nazi tyranny. He had heard of a program where Britain's Royal Air Force was accepting volunteers for service. One of the things the RAF faced was not necessarily a shortage of airplanes, but a shortage of pilots. As later noted in a letter by a Royal Air Force officer, Art apparently told his parents that he would only be helping the RAF as a mechanic and primarily assembling aircraft. Not exactly true. When Art arrived in England via Canada, the RAF soon learned that this American volunteer had 1,800 hours of flying time, most of it low-powered light aircraft. Even the multi-engine Ford tri-motors cruised at not much more than 100 miles per hour in relatively low altitude. Here we go. Shortly after arriving in England, being accepted in the RAF, an illegal act, by the way, since the United States was a neutral country and was frowned upon by the US government to fight for a belligerent foreign country, Art was assigned to number 7 operational training squadron. Here, he was put into the front cockpit of a North American Harvard advanced training plane. This airplane was built by North American Aviation out in California, and I think they had a factory in Dallas too. The American forces also use this, the Army Air Corps, Army Air Force, also the United States Navy. The Air Force called it the T6 or AT-6 Texan. The Navy called it an SNJ. This was the advanced training plane for American forces. And it was said that if you could fly this airplane, you could fly anything, including the P-51 Mustang or the Spitfire, whatever, what have you. I've actually had instruction in one of these airplanes. You got 600 horsepower up front, retractable landing gear, controllable pitch propeller. It's a fairly advanced airplane, and while it's an honest airplane, it didn't have any real quirks, but you still had to fly it by the numbers. You had to know what you were doing with this airplane. Let's see. Yeah, 600 horsepower, top speed of about 200 miles per hour, weighing 5,000 pounds, which was interesting to me because the Super Cub I learned to fly in was exactly 1/4 the weight, 1/4 the horsepower, and about half the speed. The other thing with this airplane, when I had an hour of instruction, you get in, the instructor put me in the front seat and said, okay, he started the engine, he said, okay, it's your airplane. So we were set to taxi up. First thing you notice is you're sitting in it, the tail wheel airplane, you cannot see over the nose. And so all the way out to the active runway, you're picking the rudder pedals, swerving back and forth. You swerve this way and you can look out this way. You swerve that way, you can see where the heck you're going. And by the time we got to the active runway, my legs were tired. Art said the machine cruised 180, and I thought it more wonderful than anything I ever imagined. I practiced in it for a few days and then was told I might go on to flying Spitfires. So here's an article again. I found just a lot of articles about Art in the Winona papers, and he tells why he joined the RAF. So after getting checked out in that advanced training plane in the Harvard, he was assigned on August 3rd, 1940 to a frontline squadron with Spitfires. Art writes, this was the very height of my hopes. Of all England's superb fighting planes, the Supermarine Spitfires are generally considered master of them all and the world's deadliest fighter. The pilots assigned to fly them consider themselves the luckiest of pilots. In fact, the engines are 12-cylinder Rolls Royce of about 1,050 horsepower with an emergency boost giving them nearly 1,400 horsepower for combat. Each has 8 machine guns mounted in the wings. The cruising speed of a Spitfire is nearly 300 miles per hour and top speed nearly 400 miles per hour. Later versions of the Spitfire, the Mark 14 and so on, they were up over 400 miles an hour. In fact, some of them were used to knock down V1 flying bombs. They would fly up alongside, get a wingtip under the flying bomb's wing, and then bank away and then cause the buzz bomb to go out of control. To myself, we've been instructing for the last year and a half in trainers of about 40 horsepower, the original paper cubs, that cruised at 60 miles an hour. This was such a change that there just didn't seem to be any connection with my former flying. First time I took a Spitfire up, I felt more like a passenger than a pilot. With additional practice and after flights with a flight leader in formations, Art was assigned to 64 squadrons flying out of Royal Air Force Kenley, just south of London, and directly in and under the path of swarms of German bombers and fighters that were going after the British airfields and later London itself. Wasn't long before Art found himself in combat. He noted the first time that he got a German plane in his gun sights, the first time he tried to take another man's life, and then he realized that this was also the first time somebody was trying to take his life. This is a very nice photo of a Spitfire. You see the red patches on the wing, those cover up the machine guns. And the plane came back and there were holes in it. You knew that that pilot had been in combat and fired his guns in anger. Quentin Reynolds of Collier's magazine visited the airfield that Art was flying out of one day. Art actually came back and he had a big hole in the fuselage where a German fighter had hit his airplane. Fortunately, it wasn't too much further forward. Anyway, some of the British pilots said, "Oh, you ought to talk to Art over here, Texas Shorty," they called him. And so Quentin Reynolds interviewed Art for Collier's magazine, and I actually found at one point an original copy of that magazine, and you've gone to look at it later. So yeah, on that day, it was August 5th, 1940, not long after he got to England already, on that day, a squadron intercepted a formation of German bombers accompanied by escorting German fighters. After the flight leader yelled, "Tally ho," each pilot picked out a target. Art wrote, "I went down in a screaming dive, pushing everything forward, throttle, emergency throttle, propeller control and all. The other German plane had a good start, but I had the advantage of several thousand feet more altitude and gaining speed by diving. The wind shrieked across my windshield and the Rolls-Royce engine bellowed while the airspeed indicator moved steadily around its dial and on up past 400 miles per hour. After diving, climbing, and turning, Art caught up to his intended prey, but nearly lost his life due to a beginner's mistake. I caught up with him just over Cape Grenade on the French coast, and that was how I entered France for the first time. As I drew close, he abandoned flight and turned to face me like a cornered animal. But I was too close behind him now, and I simply followed him in the turn, cutting it shorter than he could and crowding in on him. I knew I was outmaneuvering him, and I felt I had him now. He was almost in the circle of my gun sights. This time I keep him there. Pow! Sounded exactly as someone had blown a big paper sack and burst it behind my ears, and it shook the plane and followed by a noise like hail on a tin roof. So he's getting hit by the machine gun fires from a German fighter. The melee continued. I was terribly hot and tired and sweaty and was conscious of that more than of being scared. I wished I could rest. The bright sun beat down hotly through the canopy over my cockpit. My clothes were heavy and I was hampered by my parachute straps and street harness straps as I twisted about in the cockpit, trying to see above, below, and behind, and to the sides to keep track of my playmates. After several more minutes of dogfighting, Art managed to get back over the English Channel and land his damaged Spitfire at RAF Hawkins. Finally, I noticed across the water in the distance, this is Art, a ribbon of white lining the horizon. And I remembered reading years ago in my geography book about the white cliffs of Dover. Just then, that looked like the promised land. And so it happened that RAF Hawkins, Quentin Reynolds, the writer for Collier's, happened to be his name, and Reynolds included Donahue in his article of Spitfire and the Boy. let's see, let me catch up with a little bit more on the Spitfire. And by the way, at that time, a movie came out, talking about the Spitfire airplane with David Niven and Leslie Howard. I may recognize Leslie Howard's name. Gone with the Wind. He was later killed during the war. He was flying in an airplane on transport from Lisbon up to England. And they actually think he was an agent for the British. And the Germans knew that he was on board this plane, and they ambushed it out over the ocean and never made it to England. He was killed. But anyway, some pictures of the Spitfire. You see the cockpit. Controls. So this is a photograph taken at Henley, and that airplane actually has 64 Squadron coating on the side. I don't know that that's Arthur Donahue in the cockpit. It could be, although I think somebody told me that that photo was from March of 1940, so it would be several months before Art actually got there. That's what Art would have looked like taxiing out and scrambling. So where are we at? August 12th, 1940, Art's Battle of Britain service came to an end. After a couple of patrols earlier in the day, 64 Squadron was scrambled again to intercept yet another German raid. And that whole summer, these British pilots, they're going up once, twice, 3, 4 times a day, because the Germans keep sending bombers over. Initially, they wanted to knock out all of the British airfields so that they couldn't, send up fighters to resist. Well, then at one point, somebody goofed up and a German bomber hit London, and then the British hit Berlin or some German targets, and then it got going back and forth. But they say that probably saved England because it took the focus off the British airfields and put it on the British cities during the Blitz. So August 12th, I'm cruising along in a rift between the clouds, and I saw above me into the southeast more airplanes than I've ever seen at one time in my life. It was 450 plus raid coming across the channel. Right across in front of me flashed a Heinkel 113 fighter, just skimming along the tops of the clouds. I opened up the throttle, an emergency throttle, and turned after it. Then, as I was getting close enough to open fire and didn't look back for a moment, he gets hit again. I wrote the familiar sound of exploding cannon shells cracked my eardrums and my plane shook. Shrapnel banged and rattled, and white traces streamed by. For all my care, I'd been surprised again from behind by a second Hun. I tried desperately to make a quick turn to evade him, but for some reason I didn't seem able to turn, and my plane was just going up in a gentle climb straight ahead. The firing at me lasted only a second, but I expected it would start again. I was above the clouds just a little now, and I must get down into them for concealment. I pushed forward on the control stick, pushed forward on the stick of an airplane, and put some nose down, and go down. But the stick just flopped limply all the way forward. No results. The elevator controls, the back of the airplane, control cables were gone, I realized. Then I saw that I couldn't turn. My feet were pumping back and forth on the rudder pedals. It produced no response. The rudder cables were gone. This was bad. I could smell powder smoke, hot and strong. It was from the cannon shells and the incendiary bullets. Smoke from an incendiary bullet. An incendiary bullet is one that it's very hot and will cause a fire. It's some phosphorus. Smoke from an incendiary bullet was curling up beside me, lodged in the frame of the machine and smoldering there. My heart pounded and my mouth tasted salty. I wondered if this was the end of the line. This was very bad. Not one to give up, Art thought maybe he might be able to roll the plane upside down and then dive away into the clouds below. Art wrote, first I jerked open the hatch over my cockpit so I could get out in a hurry if things didn't work out. I had just done that when I was suddenly receiving another salvo from a third plane behind me. The din and confusion were awful. I remember seeing the instrument panel breaking up in front of me and holes dotting the gas tank in front of me. One of the things about the Spitfire and the Hurricane, they had like a Model A Ford, they had a gas tank right in front of you. In the cowling. And our smoke trails of tracer bullets appeared right inside the cockpit. Bullets were going by between my legs, and the bright flash of an incendiary bullet going past my leg and into the gas. I remember being surprised that I wasn't scared. I was too dazed. There was a finality about the silent salvo, and it lasted about 2 or 3 seconds. Then there was a kind of silence. A light glowed in the bottom of the fuselage somewhere up front. Then a little red tongue of flame licked out inquiringly from under the gas tank in front of me. I curled up the side of it. It became a hot little bonfire in one corner of the cockpit. I remembered my parachute and jerked the locking pin that secured my seat straps. I started to climb out just as the whole cockpit became a furnace. Many of the British pilots were burned severely. It's kind of one of the doctors kind of pioneered plastic surgery for a lot of these very badly burned pilots. Falling away from his burning, uncontrollable Spitfire, Art pulled his parachute ripcord. He said, a moment of suspense and then a heavy pull that stopped my fall. There I am, quite safe, if not sound. Everything was calm and quiet. It was hard to realize it was only a few seconds out of a battle. Art had somewhat yet constant self-deprecating sense of humor. He wrote, looking myself over, I found that I was even less to look at than usual. I was aching all over, mostly from bruises received from being dragged out of the cockpit so quickly. One of my trouser legs was torn and burned completely off. My bare leg, which wouldn't be called attractive at best, was anything but pretty now. It was bruised and skinned in a dozen places, and there was a sizable burned area around my ankle where the skin hung loosely. But I could find no bullet wounds, burns and bruises. My right hand and right side of my face were burned too. But it felt good to be alive after what my prospects were a few moments before. I sighed and said aloud, feeling that the occasion demanded some recognition, well, Art, this is what you asked for. How do you like it? Now, if you think his troubles were over at that moment, they weren't. So he's floating down in his parachute, and all of a sudden there's some more banging going on, and his parachute is starting to collapse on him. And he's thinking, his initial thought is that there have been reports of German pilots machine gunning parachuting pilots while they were in their chute. So that was Art's initial thought. He was a target for a German fighter. Turns out he was coming down, and right nearby was a British anti-aircraft gun battery, and they're blazing away, and the concussion from that muzzle blast is causing his parachute, his umbrella to collapse. Well, he did make it down okay, and so he winds up already before Churchill gave his famous speech, he winds up in the hospital already. And they patched him up, and he goes back to flying. September 15th, just 2 days from now, about 3-4 years ago, was Adler Tag, Eagle Day. The Luftwaffe expects to find the Royal Air Force decimated and unable to offer meaningful resistance. And yet the Royal Air Force on that day mauled the German bomber formations once again, and so badly that Hermann Goering and Hitler call out Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England. So during his convalescence, Art writes an article for the Saturday Evening Post. And somewhere I got coming up a photo of Art, and it was said that he was never without his little portable typewriter. He always had that with him, even when he wound up overseas or in Southeast Asia. So, yeah, here's the article he wrote for the Saturday Evening Post. And that article becomes the basis of Tally Ho, Yankee, and Spitfire. So, he recovers from his burns and his wounds and his bruises. And he goes back to flying. Here's a photograph. It's taken from a British fighter. These fighters, were pilots who claimed that he shot down an enemy airplane. They actually had cameras mounted in the wings. So anytime you pressed the firing button, that camera activated, and so it would record if you hit a German bomber or a fighter. And so here you see the tracers going out and hitting that German bomber. And for each one of those tracer trails, generally there was about 7 other bullets that you can't see. Here's the Collier's article that I was talking about, a Spitfire and a boy. Here's another photograph of a Spitfire from 64 Squadron. And this photograph up here, if you look standing on the wing of that Spitfire on the far right, that's Arthur Donahue with the squadron. And then back home, here's a newspaper article, Arthur Donahue hurt in a fight over England, came proud flyer down the second Nazi plane. That's a famous photograph of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And you can see the contrails of the German and British fighters overhead in combat. I have a book that records the Battle of Britain virtually day by day. And it was, you know, what happened not only to the British pilots, but also has a record of the German pilots. And so here on Monday, the 12th of August, where he was shot down and wounded, number 6, 64 Squadron out of Kenley, shot down by a Mr. Schmidt, pilot bailed out, wounded at 1720 hours, pilot officer Arthur Donahue, and flying the Spitfire. On the 18th of August, the Germans actually attacked the Royal Air Force Field Kenley. And here's a photograph of some of those German bombers taken from another German bomber. Crossing the channel, you see them at very, very low level. And the White Cliffs is over and the beach you head in, it's kind of, you can't really see it, it's there. But, and here's another photograph. And they're right over the airfield. And you can see the revetments, and you can see a Spitfire parked in that protected enclosure. And so there's a photo taken from one of the German bombers as they attacked Kenley. Then I mentioned he wrote the article for the Saturday Evening Post. There's a photo of Art recovering from his wound. You can see he's got his his right arm all bandaged up. The fellow with them is Squadron Leader Aeneas McDonald. He was actually an Olympic track star prior to the war. And here's the article from the Saturday Evening Post. Those airplanes in that lower right corner, those were Hurricanes that wasn't flying at that point yet. So Tally Ho was Yankee and Spitfires published in late 1941 by Macmillan. Over in England, went on to 10 American editions and 1 English edition from Macmillan. And it was also published in Braille. It became a fairly best-selling book. It was heavily censored, as you might imagine. It didn't give a lot of details, but nevertheless, Art was able to tell his story. So he recovers, he goes back to flying for a while, and then he managed to get a couple of weeks leave from the Royal Air Force. And so in March of 1941, and we're still talking what, 8 months, 6 months, 9 months before Pearl Harbor. He comes home to St. Charles, and of course the folks back home are anxious to see him, and they put on a big banquet. And at the St. Charles Commercial Club, was held at the gymnasium. And several dignitaries spoke, and then Art got up and actually spoke and talked a little about his experiences. And the Olmsted County History Center actually has a recording of that speech.
We're gonna cross our fingers.
Now,
That works.
Unfortunately, one of the politicians talked so long, and then he was followed by Max Conrad, who thankfully got up and said, look, I'm a pilot, I'm not used to talking, I'll let Art talk. And he got off, got away from the dice and let Art speak. Unfortunately, they weren't able to capture all of Art's speech because they ran out of room on the recording. I think it's a big recording disc, kind of like a record. They ran out of room on the disc, but we do have some of him actually speaking. We hope. Fingers crossed, everybody. So we thought it would be really fun to be able to hear his voice.
I promise we tested this and it worked. I'll come back to it at the end and mess around with it a little bit,
Sure.
because I know that it works. We tested it. in the state card.
The highlight of his talk, they asked him, he actually had a,
It works. Yeah.
okay,
all the way up, and we're supposed to carry this. Okay, I'm scared.
he's talking about his May West, his light tree reserve. And it's called the May West for obvious reasons.
Water.
That's how many so. And they laughed. And everybody knew May West was that now.
This is quite a long list. If anyone, I can send this to anyone if they are really interested. On the way out, I'll just have you write down your email address and I would be happy to send it to you so you can do it.
So they had the banquet there.
Question for you. Did he wear his uniform at all? And say-
No, he did not, because it would have been illegal for him to do that, because he was fighting for a belligerent country, and America wanted to be totally neutral at that point. And, FDR was under a lot of pressure to come into the war, and if you've seen the movie, I think it's Darkest Hour, and how Churchill was trying to persuade FDR to get involved, and eventually it worked out that Lend-Lease program where they provided destroyers and stuff to, go after the German U-boats and
So along that line, when he came back and he never got in trouble with that story, he's writing a book and he's speaking in St. Charles, never,
nothing that I've seen.
yeah.
Of course, the folks in St. Charles, they were just thrilled to see him.
The VFW is named after him.
I'm sorry?
The VFW in St. Charles is named after him.
Right, yeah. Is it still there? Is the VFW or the Legion?
The VFW,
Oh,
it's,
it was the Ham Donahue, wasn't it?
right, yep.
Okay.
But I think my uncles were all with him, like, in the school with him at that thing.
I see. Yeah,
So
yeah.
it-
Maybe it's listed on that graduation list too.
Well, no, my dad was born the same time he was born.
I see.
That's-
So
Mhm.
anyway, this is a side view of a Spitfire with the SH denoting 64 squadron, and then each airplane had its own, W identifier. That was their squadron patch, I want to say not patch, but, yeah. Mental block, I can't remember what 10x for positive stands for in Latin, something like always ready or for the future or something like that, but, anyway, here's some photos from the various newspaper coverage of that banquet. The bottom one, he's hugging his mom. The top one, and he's got his little sister talking to with his mom and dad on each side, Frank and Ada Donahue. There he is in that May West I was talking about, where he was speaking, and then some various photos at the banquet at the table. And so then after a couple of weeks, he headed back to England via Canada. One of the interesting things, he stopped, he was hosted at the home of the Mayo brothers in Rochester, and he toured the clinic and looked at their low pressure altitude chamber. And of course, being a fighter pilot, you're interested in that thing, and aerial medicine. So here he is. I mean, it's almost like hour by hour they were following this poor guy around. Here's a photo, and he was very, very clear. He said, you know, when I go back to fighting and flying, he said, I'm gonna remember everybody in St. Charles, and I will carry you with me. Yeah, Judge Murphy, he was the one that got a little long-winded on that recording and used up all the space. So he goes back to England, and by this time, the United States, there are some more American volunteer pilots over in England. They became known as the Eagle Squadron. Art joined up with that. There was 71 Squadron, I think, other squadrons were part of that wing or group. Anyway, so he was with them for a little while, and then he decided there's not enough action here. I'm going back to one of the British squadrons. And so he did. He left the Eagle Squadron. But there he is on the far left there, leaning back against the wing on that Spitfire, and you can see the Eagle Squadron logo on underneath the canopy there of that plane. And a lot of American who later became with the Army Air Forces got their start with the Eagle Squadron and became aces during the war, flying Mustangs and P-47s. There he is. I mentioned he was never without his little portable typewriter, it seemed. I read somewhere that he had an IQ above 140, which I think is pretty amazing. And then another newspaper article, you see action again with the Royal Air Force. So he's back in England, and he has a friend over there, who was some photos of the airfield, RAF Kenley. That building and hangar is still there, I believe. Here's an aerial shot. You can see the one intersecting runway has obviously been bombed. And just the one runway, it looks like it's been packed as well. That's November of 41, kind of right in the middle of the blitz. And at some point, he had a brother, Robert, who ran a radio station or worked at a radio station out east, Springfield, Massachusetts, I believe. And British Broadcasting had an interview with Art, and they piped it over to his brother's radio station, and he piped it to KWNO in Winona, and so the folks in Winona got to hear an interview with Art from England. So, of course, that was before the internet and satellite. I imagine there was quite a little work involved in setting that up. Art was always rather cocky about British pilots and stuff. He thought the German pilots weren't all that good. Actually, they were pretty good by this time, early in the war. They had been, a lot of them had been veterans of the Spanish Civil War. You know, so he's back in England. He has a friend who's gonna take a squadron of hurricane fighters to southeast, actually initially to the Middle East. And so Art says, I think I'll go with you guys. So they load up these hurricanes on a British aircraft carrier, and the way they go, and they're sailing through the Strait of Gibraltar. They're on their way to, I don't know, Egypt, somewhere there. And Pearl Harbor happens. And the RAF guys say, hey, Art, if you want to go with the Americans, go with the Army Air Force. The ironic thing is, before the war, Art tried to join the Army Air Force. They turned him down. I don't know how many times they didn't want him. I don't know why. Maybe I don't think he was very tall. Maybe that had something to do with it. But anyway, so he said, nah, I'm going to stick with my British comrade. So they're headed, but then they get diverted to Singapore, where the Japanese are about to take over everything in Southeast Asia. And that was the result of his second book, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So from Minnesota farm fields to the skies over England to hot and muggy Southeast Asia, Art Donahue was there. The hurricanes that were flying at Singapore were not a match for the superb Japanese Zero. Not only that, as the hurricanes went down in combat, the remaining planes that were damaged and barely airworthy, you could say, held together with baling wire and shooting guns. Nevertheless, Donahue and his RAF comrades put up a good fight, but they were overwhelmed. Day after day, as in the summer of 1940, Donahue and his squadron mates took off in their hurricanes 2 and 3 times a day to fight the Japanese Army and Navy pilots as they closed in on Singapore and Palembang. On the last mission at Singapore, Donahue and the squadron received word of the large flotilla of Japanese landing barges, each jammed with Japanese soldiers approaching the Bangka Straits and Minsi River. Donahue wrote, "What a massacre." And so he and the other hurricanes in the squadron attacked these landing barges. And they're shooting up the landing barges, strafing the Japanese troops in the barges, and as they're coming ashore, I don't know how many passes Art made at them, but as he's pulling away, he gets hit by anti-aircraft fire. A piece of shrapnel goes right through the calf of one leg. And Art writes in last flight from Singapore, even though he was a farm boy, he was scared to death the sight of blood. And so he's flying along and he's losing a lot of blood. And so he's not only fainty from the sight of it, but he's getting fainty from the loss of blood. And so he describes, he said, the only thing I could do, I took my one flying glove off and I gripped my teeth and I jammed it in the hole. So his flying glove was literally filling with blood. So he's headed back to base in this damaged hurricane, and he's on the verge of passing out. And to read his account, it's a miracle he made it, and he made a landing. And of course, they got him in a hospital, and then eventually they got him on a ship, and they sent him, I think, via India to the Middle East, and then back to England. So he recovers. Oh yeah, he says, yeah, I nearly fainted. Then he thought of opening his oxygen regulator. Of course, it all flew with oxygen mask, and turned the flow up such that I could have flown at 40,000 feet or something. He said, the fainting eased up, but still the blood flowed. I realized I must do something better and quick. I'm sure I could never do it now, but I was desperate then, and it seemed easy. I had to let go the hold I had on my trouser leg above the wound, grabbed up the torn cloth right over it, twisted it, and jammed my gloved fist knuckles first as deep as I could into the large hole, and held it that way. So there's a picture and he writes about this incident in last flight from Singapore. One of the other pilots came in to land and he apparently couldn't stop it. He crashed through the fence on the north side of the airfield. And so anyway, that's what a Hawker hurricane looks like. Kind of a generation before the Spitfire. Yeah, well, they were contemporaries, but So anyway, he makes it back to London. And what does our hero do after he recovers? He goes back to flying in combat. But in the meantime, he does get word that because of his action over Singapore, he's been awarded, cited for the Distinguished Flying Cross, Royal Air Force's Distinguished Flying Cross. He would never actually receive the medal. And here's an article about that, you know. And by the way, when he was in combat over Singapore, we're talking February, March 1942. So by this time, of course, the United States is in the war. It's what a British DFC looks like. And this was a blurb from the London Gazette, 27th of March, 1942. This officer has carried out many low-level reconnaissance stories and has successfully attacked enemy shipping and ground objectives. On one occasion, whilst carrying out an attack against enemy troops attempting a landing, flying officer Donahue silenced the enemy's fire, enabling the rest of the formation to press home their attacks with impunity. He has destroyed several enemy aircraft. And I believe Art is recognized among the British as an ace. An ace is somebody who's down 5 enemy aircraft. There's a great picture of Art. And by this time also, when he goes to this next squadron, he is painted on the engine cowling and behind the propeller and before the cockpit there, he is painted message from Minnesota. And I believe that's maybe the airplane went down. So he goes back to flying out of England again. And on one particular mission, they're over the coast of France and they're coming back, and the British radar calls them up and says, by the way, you got a bogey following you on your 6th. But they get back to base and land the next day, September 11th, 1942. Art goes up and he decides, I'm going to see if I can draw that airplane out again. And he goes about the same time of day. And sure enough, a German Ju-88 bomber comes out. That was actually quite a fast airplane. It was twin engine, but it was fast. So Art gets into a scrap with this airplane and he shoots it up. But in return, his engine apparently is hit by return fire. And Art radios, I'm going to have to ditch in the channel. They think he maybe tried to bail out, but by that point he was too low to bail out. His chute never would have opened. And so apparently he ditched the airplane. And despite hours and hours of searching, they never find him or his airplane again. And to this day, he is missing in action, presumed killed in action. So September 11th, 1932. I can't prove it, but based on the records and the time and a police report, this may be the airplane that Art shot up and made a crash landing in this field. And it's the same day, about the time that Art got into a fight with an airplane. And so
Is this in Britain or in UK?
I'm sorry,
Is this in Britain or in France?
this would be on the coast of France. Actually, I do know the exact place.
I'm just curious.
Yeah. Close to Ardenburg. Crash landing taking place at 07:30 hours. So, and of course, they're taking the Western Union telegram to Art's parents. At that point, of course, they think he's just missing. His parents go on for some time, not wanting to hold a funeral service or memorial service because they think maybe he got picked up maybe by the Germans and is, sitting in a German prisoner of war camp. But then eventually, August of 43, he's declared or presumed gone. Reported missing and acted off the Belgian post. Bringing it on patrol in November 1942. Because other airmen saw the plane drop into the sea, and since then, no word has been heard of the fire. According to British military procedures, sufficient time has elapsed so that for legal reasons, he is officially presumed to be dead. So, so he fails to return, and of course, his squadron mates have to clean up his locker and gather up his belongings to be sent home. And what do they find? They find the manuscript, the last flight from Singapore. And so apparently it was complete. They sent it off to McMillan, and later that year, 1943, in public posthumously. And there it is, yeah, December 1943. And also by this time, Art was apparently in line for all of his service and his experience. He was in line to become a squadron commander. And he would have been the only foreigner to hold that title in a British squadron or group. Guess he never was able to do that. So, Art's name appears on the Battle of Britain Memorial at Victoria Embankment in London. At that point, when they made that monument, they were the only 11 known Americans who served in the Battle of Britain. There were a total of about something a little over 3,000 pilots recognized for their Battle of Britain service. And they were each awarded a kind of like that purple and white stripe on the DFC. They were awarded the Battle of Britain class. And I think as of today, I don't believe there are any Battle of Britain veterans alive anymore. The last one's just recently passed away. And most of them were well over 100 years old. So anyway, at that time, there were only 11 known Americans to serve in the Battle of Britain. Some Americans did go to England. They claimed they were Canadian, and so they were listed as Canadians, even though they were Americans, which, as I mentioned, it was illegal, actually. So anyway, Art's name appears with the others. Pilot Officer Arthur Donahue would have eventually should have been flight lieutenant or flight leader. Interestingly, I did trade emails. I want to say Pilot Officer J.K. Haviland was the only one of those to survive the war. Every other one of those Americans who served in the Battle of Britain were killed at some point later, if not during the Battle of Britain, later during World War II. Haviland was the only one that survived, but the other ones, you notice Pilot Officer Andy Manador. He has an interesting story. He and his family, his parents came to this country from Russia in, I want to say about 1920 or so. And his dad had been a policeman, I believe, in Petersburg, Russia. And at one point, his dad arrested a young punk who later became known as Joseph Stalin. Imagine if they had locked him up for 20, 30 years, you know? How history might have been different. But all the rest of them, you also see listed there, where is he? Billy Fisk. Billy Fisk was a sledding champion in the 1932 Olympics. But he refused to participate in the 36 Winter Olympics because of Hitler. He just didn't have any time for that. So anyway, here's some shots of the Battle of Britain Monument. And by the way, that list there and Art's name there, my sister and brother were in England, and they knew of my interest in Arthur Donahue, and so they actually took a rubbing. That's I've given a copy of that rubbing to the St. Charles Library. And so the Battle of Britain was listed as the 10th of July, 1940 to the 31st of October, 1940. So if he served in combat during that time, he was honored as a Battle of Britain weapon. And then here's some shots of that mine, various scenes of that monument. Art's name also appears on the RAF memorial in this one, out at Runnymede. And I believe that's a little bit east of London. And you can see on the far left there, behind those pillars, list of names. I think there's 20 or 30,000 Royal Air Force pilots, air crew, navigator body that went missing and never found. And so Art's name also appears with them. He was 29 years old. Commemorative panel 65, country of service, the United Kingdom, awards, extended flying cross. Additional info, son of Frank and Art Donahue, a native of the USA. And at St. Charles in their little memorial downtown, his name appears, Arthur Donahue, and then there was a plaque given to his family by the Battle of Britain Historical Society. In 2001, I wrote an article for the Battle of Britain Historical for their annual magazine, and it was published. I have a Xerox copy of it. At one point, Art's spare Battle of Britain flying gloves, he carried them home to the U.S. and he gave them as a gift to his dad. I suppose he thought maybe his dad was wearing them driving the tractor. They also had, as he mentioned, piece of a shot down Messerschmitt 109 and May West life jacket. Here's what RAF Henry looked like a few years ago. I think we got to run these pretty well fixed up. This is what is interesting. This is the Royal Air Force Henley Officers Mess. And about 10 years ago, there was a lot of vandalism, and then they had a fire, and the roof went in, and it looked like it was probably going to be raised. And there was several developers interested in that property, and they wanted to, build condos, whatever. Just yesterday on my Facebook feed, I follow the Friends of RAF Henley, was posted this. RAF Henley followers may find the Imperial property group worth following as they develop the old officers' nest into 54 apartments. And there is hope for the RAF Henley officers' nest. No doubt Art put his meals there. I wrote a little note, congratulations, it was awesome, and I hope that in the common areas of those apartments, there is a historic display that talks about all the fellows who flew out there. This is part of the airfield where you saw that German bomber picture of the revetments where they would park the airplanes behind these tall walls and those openings there go down into a bomb shelter. So if your airfield comes under attack, you can duck in there. And today they have taken one of those revetments and built a memorial right in the center of it where a Spitfire or maybe a Hurricane fighter would have been parked. And today the Royal Air Force Air Cadets use the airfield for glider training. They say if you want to learn to fly, really well, learn in a glider, a soar. You have to manage the speed and the altitude and your energy really well. You don't have an engine to pull you out of trouble. So here, I gave this talk at the Antiquarian Book Fair up at St. Thomas a few years ago, and I thought it would be of interest to talk about Macmillan, who published both of Art's books. And I went online, of course, again, this is a couple of years old. I think this is ABE, Antiquarian Booksellers website, and looked up to see what copies of his books are available, and You can see the prices depending, again, on condition. Anywhere from $125 to $298 if you get one a really nice copy with the dust jacket. Yeah, you can spend a lot of money. But as I was saying before we got going, there are digitized copies, print on demand copies of last flight from Singapore that are apparently out there. There's one $200. So, and then, I think of the author who wrote, the other more recent book about Art Donahue, Life Short but Wide, I think is the title of it. And I think they have a copy here for sale. This is a painting that was done on the front cover for that book. So, and here's some additional resources. Now it's Kershaw wrote his book about the Americans. Survivors. Some 22,000 Spitfires were built 1938 to 46. 300 surviving museums, private collections. Of those, 50 are airworthy and another 20 are being restored. 14,582 hurricanes built, 17 survived in airworthy condition. And watch for the channel continue. So I always close. See if I can get through this. I always close with the last paragraph of Art's first book. Oops, that's the wrong book. Here in Singapore cold.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah, my copy here is probably 1942. Somebody who bought it at that point in time. So Art is back in England. He says, I can hear some Messerschmitt 109s overhead now, and I know that somewhere up there trying to locate them is the patrol which Chris and I shall be relieving in another half hour. If I step outside the door and look southeast, I can see the French coast all the way from Dunkirk down to Boulogne, resting along the farther edge of the clear blue expanse of water which bounds the no man's land in the air war. In the great deep blue sea of air above this water, eerie and scary, to watch over the channel. I used a lot of time.
No, it's all right. It was fascinating. We usually like to take just a few minutes at the end if anyone has any questions they wanted to ask or, if not, I just want to really thank you for coming in. That was fascinating, and your amount of research is really quite amazing.
Well, it's interesting, you know, I guess a year or so ago, I happened to be in St. Charles in one of the antique shops. And I said to the owner, I said, oh, I imagine we probably know Arthur Donahue. Who? So, you know, it's a little known story, even with his books and a couple other books.
I did not know that he had met nor spoken to Quentin Reynolds.
Yeah, not only Quentin Reynolds, but William Shira, who wrote.
So my challenge is, why was his story never made into a movie, a play, or whatever else it was? The books stand by themselves, I know, but you would think that that figure would have moved forward.
You would think somebody in Hollywood would get a hold of it.
Is there an answer? Was there a script at some point, or was it forgotten?
Not that I'm aware of. You think Tom Cruise would?
So Alex Kershaw's book was supposed to be made into a movie
That's right,
about the Eagle Squadron.
right.
And Tom Cruise is supposed to be Billy Fisk. But the British were already upset about that.
Yeah, you follow. When some of these movies come out, and like I say, I follow some of the British web, Facebook pages, and invariably, there'll be somebody who will complain, oh yeah, damn Americans, they won the war all by themselves, you know? Never mind us British. Yeah.
Well, how about another hand?
Thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed speaking to you.
Someone asked earlier, how do you find out about the different events we do here? If you just go to the Olmsted County History page and click on the events, we have a weekly list. I'm new here and I just was told I have too many things planned. So, how can there be too many?
Yeah,
That's right.
you wanna tell people about it.
I know, right? So, just so you know, next week, if you're interested, on Thursday night, we're doing the Master Gardeners. We're gonna talk about fall gardening and what we need to do, and then they're gonna do a tour of their heirloom gardens they have out back here. On Saturday, the 14th, we're bringing in a wonderful woman who's gonna talk about the history of feed sack fashions. And the John Marshall fashion classes are actually going to design and make their own feed sack dresses that will be on display here. If you have youngsters, there's an activity book called Making Minnesota that a lot of kids have. The author and the illustrator will be here to talk about that. And then the 26th, we have the Gold Cross Legacy event. And then the next one I'm super excited about on October 3rd is about the Minnesota State Hospitals. There's a woman named Susan Bartlett Foote who wrote a book called The Crusade for Lost Souls. And it's about the reform movement that kicked in like the 1940s to try and make some changes to the Minnesota State Hospitals. We did not have a very good record on treatment in state hospitals. So you can always go to our website. If you'd like me to see if I can get you that file, that clip of Art's speech, why don't I do this? I'll flip both of these pages over, and if you just clearly write your email address, I will do my best to get that sent out to you, and hopefully it will travel, you know, through the cloud. So thank you again, Frederick, and thank you for coming out. Have a wonderful evening. And thank you for supporting local history. Yes.
Oh, I want to forget it. That's history.
Yeah.
Oh, boy, I see that black. The first I seen that.
Wow.
I was black. First time I've seen that.
Yeah.
Right. So I was able to stand up. Yeah, there's. I read that. Oh, that's what got me to learn about the fact that there's there we go.
You have exact change.
We need two young guys. Flying out. I think you got.
Just gonna stop my recording.
Yes.
Don't
Come over.
you don't have to listen to all of this.
Mr. Johnny. Hey, go ahead there. Yeah. Like a long way from that bull again. You know, I went back to 37, came all the way down to the wall.